for the way his mind turns. One of the books he's written a number, has the very interesting title, The Evil Princes of Martin Place, by which he's referring to the members of the Reserve Bank board, no doubt.
I am.
You are.
And the institution, generally speaking.
And the institution more generally. So let's start off with this. You lump a number of people into the Marxist camp, people who this audience might find a little bit surprising to see included. So, for example, John Howard, our former Prime Minister, you would consider buying into the Marxist position. So could you start off by just telling us which bit of Marx you're referring to and why you think John Howard has those Marxist tendencies?
Okay. The document I referred to is Marx's and Engels' Communist Manifesto of 1848. Section 2, if memory serves, lists 10 demands which the workers will forcibly implement when they seize the reins of power from the bourgeoisie. Demand number 5 is a particular interest, and it's not quite an exact quote, my memory's not exact, but a near quote: centralization of credit in the hands of a state bank backed by an absolute monopoly. Centralization of credit in the hands of a state-owned bank in the hands of a monopoly. That sentence, as well as any single sentence, encapsulates, defines, epitomizes the modern contemporary conception of money, banking, and credit. I'm slightly unfair to John Howard or to Margaret Thatcher, who is also an enthusiastic proponent of this, which in effect is central banking. Milton Friedman was an enthusiastic proponent of central banking. Just as an aside, Marxist ideas, as encapsulated in that list of 10 demands, have seeped so deeply into our thinking and into our actions that we're really not aware of it anymore. As an amusing parlor game, it's interesting to go to Google, find the Communist Manifesto, list the 10 demands, and then write down words like Tony Abbott, Julia Gillard, Wayne Swan, and then do Google searches to find citations, quotes from them, just how many of these tenets of the Communist Manifesto they seem to affirm. And your findings might be a bit different from mine. By that criterion, who is a communist? Tony Abbott would be a 50 to 60% communist on the basis of quotations easily discoverable by Google that seem to affirm tenets of the Communist Manifesto.
This may come to him as a slight surprise, I suspect.
That's why I say these Marxist ideas have seeped so deep into the foundations of our thinking that we're unaware of it. With Julia Gillard, you take your pick, but your findings might be different from mine. She's perhaps a 70 to 80% Marxist, and Wayne Swan and the Greens would be virtual 100% Marxist, defined by adherence on the basis of public quotations that seem to affirm those tenets in the Communist Manifesto. So we live, in that sense, in a communist world. The Soviet Union collapsed. That was regarded as somehow a triumph of democracy. What it should have been regarded as a harbinger of the collapse of Marxism here in the West.
Now, what I should have done at the beginning, before I got into some of the reasons why this is, just to make sure that everybody understands, and you can confirm this business about letting the banks fail, that's not a rhetorical question for you, is it?
Not at all.
You actually believe, and I think you said last night, just let the bastards fail.
Indeed I did. That's, if not an exact verbatim quote, it's a 95% quote. Yes, quite right.
So,
and not only just that, it's the fact that they're broke now, or they're bankrupt now, given the sorts of points I raised. Yeah. The collapse simply makes plain or makes evident, it causes the scales to fall from people's eyes. It makes plain the bankruptcy which has been inherent all along.
Yeah, and we'll come to that, because your view, as you just said there, is that it's merely just making plain what has already happened. You think they have failed.
Correct.
And that this is both an economic, but even more profoundly a moral problem about propping up an effectively immoral system which has destroyed itself in any case. Now, to get to that conclusion, which is a pretty stark one and which frightened the whole world with the global financial crisis, which you also see as part of this same thing, let's go back into something about what you think has been constructed using number 5 in the Marxist list, this central banking system. And I think you call it fractional
reserve banking.
Yeah. What is fractional reserve banking?
I'll give you the simplest possible example, to the point quite possibly of oversimplifying. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you have a check account at Bank X, doesn't matter which bank it is, with $10,000. There's actually not $10,000 which sits waiting for you to redeem it any time you please. You might think it's a deposit or something which is available upon demand, but in actual fact it isn't. Why? Because the bank has turned around and taken those funds and has lent them. In effect, it's conflated, confused two diametrically different things, a deposit on the one hand and a loan on the other. The point I made re the inherent illiquidity in solvency is that if every single person, hypothetically in Australia, sought to redeem those check accounts, the banks wouldn't be able to do it. Only with recourse, because there's only a fraction of those deposits on reserve, only with the help of that backstop could they...
And this is the Basel system, isn't it, where they say there's a certain amount of prudential capital that has to be kept, about 8% or something in different things.
The short answer is yes. The Bank of International Settlements was originally in Basel in Switzerland, where its headquarters established, in effect, and I'm simplifying again, to supervise, to monitor the financial settlements following the First World War. Finding a job to do once that task had been completed, amongst other things, have to do with recommending prudential regulations and things of that nature.
Which is essentially what you're saying, isn't it? That you say, look, of every $10,000 you put in, only a certain proportion of that, 8% or I forget whatever the prudential standards are, needs to actually be held by the bank on its balance sheet. The other 92% or so can then be lent to other people, which means it's not... Your argument is, therefore, it's not immediately available for me to make a claim on it. Is that right?
That's basically right. In actual fact, it's not a deposit in the sense that you cannot simply appear and reclaim your property. As opposed, for example, to, let's just say, the Perth Mint, in which you spend X amount of dollars to buy Y ounces of gold. In return, you receive a warehouse certificate which says that you, Simon Longstaff, have a legal right to X amount of gold. Now it's all filled into a big figurative pot there out in Perth. It would be regarded as illegal and immoral if the Perth Mint turned around and on-lent that, or created mortgages and so on, such that there are two competing claims to that same gold. If they were to do it, they'd find themselves in very, 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 very hot water. That's perfectly legal in a purely positive sense. Legal standard banking practice has been so for very roughly 150 years. So whilst it seems to me there's everything immoral about it, there's absolutely nothing whatsoever illegal about it.
And what's the problem then with the Reserve Bank and central banks in general in this system?
Several. One is that they were created to rescue what are innately bankrupt institutions, for one. That's point one. Point two is that they finance what I call the welfare warfare state, or in other contexts, the welfare state of credit, that among the privileges which they dispense is financing national governments. Among this process of creating loans, they become the financiers to governments. It's not a coincidence at all that the Federal Reserve System, whilst it was created in 1913, it rose to very great prominence in order to finance America's participation in the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the Bank of England began what today would be called open market operations in an aggressive fashion upon at the commencement of the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the monetary standard, the gold standard, government suspended it at the commencement of the First World War. Why? Because under all of those sorts of arrangements, governments can't fight wars. So the second criticism, combination of empirical and moral, is that the purpose of a central bank is to finance warfare. It's going to be very difficult to do so without that sort of a backstop.
But there's two kind of parts to your argument there. One is that the problem with the central bank is that it facilitates the fractional banking system. And secondly, that it's also financing governments, I think you're saying, beyond the system itself, to be able to do things which they could not afford to do, and that they maybe ought not to do.
Well, certainly,
like fighting wars, is that right?
Basically, yes, such that today, when I say that the United States government is bankrupt, let me carefully say, what do I mean? That the net present value of its liabilities off balance sheet, but basically the promises which it has made with respect to Medicare, Social Security, according to a fellow Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University who studies these sorts of things, as of 30th of June, was on the order of $222 trillion. That's the net present value. That's in effect the reserves that need to exist in order to finance these promises going decades into the future. Those reserves simply don't exist. In other words, the promises aren't going to be kept. Recipients of Medicare aren't going to receive the benefits that politicians solemnly promised to them. Recipients of Social Security, the pension system there, are not going to receive the benefits which politicians solemnly promised to them. Now, are we going to wake up one day and find in big headlines in the New York Times or what have you, US government goes belly up? No. It has begun, and when it began perhaps decades ago, a bankruptcy by stealth, whereby the queues, the waiting list for hip replacements and knee replacements become longer and longer. The purchasing power of Social Security becomes lower and lower. In other words, the people who depend utterly and completely upon the state, those who, alas, believe the politicians, are going to become poorer and poorer. The bankruptcy, the insolvency of the US it has begun to take that form, and as time passes will become more and more apparent in that form.
Now, presumably one of the functions of the central bank in the conditions you described then is to solve this problem by creating more money, by printing more money. And is that not a reasonable solution to the problem? In other words, the institution is doing what it's designed to do?
The short answer is that's what it's trying to do, to paper over the cracks, but ultimately it's not money substitutes, funny money. Simply creating accounting balance sheet entries doesn't create a single additional house, it doesn't create another hospital, it doesn't create an additional tin of baked beans on the supermarket shelf. What it does do is give very privileged people, let's call them for the sake of argument, investment bankers, merchant bankers, first access to those funds, which they then invest. If they spin the wheel, they make a profit on it. Who's last in the queue of the recipients would be people, alas, savers, pensioners and so on. The purchasing power of their currency has been eroded. There's some who do exceedingly well out of this system. There are others who lose massively. So part of the innate immorality of it is the fact that it basically stratifies society into the financial insiders. Mm-hmm. Heads they win, tails taxpayers and society as a general loses, and the outsiders who are barred remained outside. And their only role is much like troops in the First World War, to climb over the trenches and to be shot. They're cannon fodder for the generals who are well behind the front lines.
So let's summarise where we've got to. The basic establishment of central banking as a state monopoly is fulfilling the one aspect of the Communist Manifesto. It's part of the Marxist Engels thesis. It is financing activities by governments which they could not otherwise afford to do, some of which they ought not to do.
Such as war.
Such as war. And this is allied with an international system which is typically introducing fractional reserve banking in societies such that banks as institutions will accept the hard-earned deposits of their savers, and rather than holding them safe in the kind of the cash box, ready to be withdrawn at will, they lend them around to other people to the extent that it's so dissipated that they could not actually pay everybody if they asked for their money to come back. And that this is a system which is essentially bankrupt, and that complicit in it...
Morally and empirically. Yes.
Morally and empirically bankrupt. And that this is something in which politicians and those who benefit from this, namely, I think you're saying the bankers who take first cut on any extra money, are able to drive that system at the cost of the most marginal people in most marginal conditions, hard-working people on low incomes, pensioners and others, who progressively see the value of their own savings degraded. Have I got it right so far?
That's a rough and ready, but I think a fair and dispassionate summary of the position. Okay.
Now, you link all of this to the global financial crisis, which you say is not a failure of economics so much as an ethical failure or a moral failure. How do you see these things being connected?
Well, we've seen them before in history. We see them in spasms. In 1907, a banking panic the panic of 1907. We saw, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, a depression of 1920, 1921, which virtually nobody remembers. Why? Because, for various reasons we can discuss, governments did adopt a very strict